Mike, I want to talk about the important big picture point you make often, which is this is essentially part and parcel of a global effort to undermine particularly right-wing populism via the infiltration and handicapping of civil society organizations in America and around the world. So nonprofit civil society groups, those types of groups that get caught up in Arctic frost, according to the Grassley whistleblower documents. And we've seen this pattern played out in many other countries over the course of the Cold War and after history ended into the post-Cold War period. And I'm curious, just to get your perspective on what many Republican senators have said. It's stunning to hear somebody, no offense to Chuck Grassley, but as old as Chuck Grassley, even speak about Watergate, which is this mythical moment in American history, in the same breath as Arctic frost, which is getting virtually no corporate media coverage. But do you see them, actually? I mean, we don't have to go deep into the annals of Watergate history and relitigate how guilty or not guilty Richard Nixon was and what the CIA was up to dirty tricks-wise in Watergate. But do you think this scandal actually outranks Watergate in terms of sort of deep state operations?
Completely dwarfs it. I mean, in Watergate, look, as nasty as it was just to collect intelligence, not to try to arrest the entire DNC, like, I mean,
they thought they might have been collaborating with the Soviets in the middle of the Cold War, a couple of decades into nuclear technology. They genuinely suspected the Dems might be collaborating with the Soviets. They never found evidence of that, but that was a suspicion.
Right. I mean, imagine if Richard Nixon had arrested the Democrat political opposition, arrested his accountants, arrested his lawyers, arrested his valet, arrested his media allies, arrested thousands of his... I mean, this was a complete police state that we lived under. It was a speech police state. It was a physical police state. And they want that back on steroids. I mean, we affix gate to everything at this point when it becomes a scandal. But if you actually look back at the facts of Watergate, it's completely tame compared to what was done under the Biden administration. All gloves were off, and they were very explicit coming into the Biden administration about the need to reset norms around rule of law, to get rid of this over 2-century-old kind of silent pact that we would not indict our political opponents because that would effectively end democracy, as every election now becomes a tit-for-tat swing. And now instead of having, policy debates over tax policy and, what we're going to do about a international treaty, every election becomes life and death because if the other party wins, you're getting arrested on BS charges for having done nothing, simply because the most important agency now is the Justice Department, which determines whether or not the political enemies of the government get targeted.
And so during the Cold War, the intelligence community was obsessed mostly with left-wing populism, not entirely with left-wing populism. The Goldwater campaign, for example, was tapped as well. There were all kinds of surveilled as well. There's all kinds of fun stuff going on. But that was the kind of primary or the focus of a lot of this surveillance worldwide, not just in the United States. So I'm curious what your take is on why right-wing populism, whether it's in America or Romania, wherever. I mean, there's still, I guess you could argue, some left-wing populism that's under attack in a place like Venezuela. I'm sure you have thoughts on that, Mike. But all this is to say, it seems right now like it's especially right-wing populism that's under attack. Why is that from your perspective?
Well, you tee that up perfectly. And, Goldwater was considered a kind of right-wing populist type figure. And you have this. The easiest way to understand this is that the liberal rules-based international order, set up after World War II, posits itself as being kind of the centrist middle in between communism on its left and fascism on its right. And the thing that communism and fascism both have in common is nationalism. The left-wing nationalism through communism involves basically state control over commerce and state control over, the means of production, yada, yada.
So Allende, Chile under Allende, for example.
Right, but that same quality can be achieved in a right-wing government through right-wing nationalist structures. You have, this is fascism was said to be the merger of the the government and the state, and done for a different reason than communism, but in having a little bit of a different cultural and ethical and sort of norms and some slight differences in structure. But both of those are nationalist nodes that rebut internationalist meddling. And so you have, for example, in Venezuela right now, you have a left-wing nationalist government, you have a left-wing communist government, which has control over arguably the world's largest reserve of oil. And that government in Venezuela, being a communist government, is loath to sign it away in favorable partnerships or favorable joint or revenue sharing agreements with Western energy companies. So too it is with right-wing nationalist governments that may not want to share the revenue or may not want to give favorable terms to outside investors to be able to take advantage of the resources that they sit on, or may not want to be pushed around in international treaties or in international war mobilizations like what's happening right now around Russia and Ukraine. When Trump rose to power in 2016, a whole slew of right-wing populist nationalist movements rose to power or were on the verge of rising to power at the same time and for the same reason. Those include Bolsonaro in Brazil, who they called the Trump of the tropics, Marine Le Pen in France, Nigel Farage and his Brexit party in the UK, Matteo Salvini at the time, the Five Star Movement in Italy, the Vox Party in Spain, the AfD Party in Germany, the PIS Party in Poland. And all of these were nationalist movements that were, like many of these right-wing populist movements, are driven by the masses of voters rather than elite donor money, top-down kind of doing what's best for the NGO class. And at the time, there were two main concerns that the voters had, which were rising energy prices because of the sanctions policy that the Obama State Department imposed on Europe. I'll stick with the Europe side of this. In 2016, it was a year and a half after the disastrous coup in Ukraine in 2014 with the Maidan Square and the counter coup from Russia that ended up with the annexation of Crimea and the breakaway of eastern Ukraine, in some part backstopped by the Russians. And so in order to try to stop the counter coup in Ukraine, the Obama State Department, through Ambassador Dan Fried, the sanctions coordinator, embarked on a sanctions roadshow across Europe to try to get all the European countries to cut off their own leg to starve the Russian bear, to do these energy sanctions, to go through these energy diversification and energy security policies, to cut themselves off from Russian oil and Russian gas and buy much more expensive Western gas, rather than, which had to be, LNG, liquefied natural gas. You have these huge reservoirs in the Permian Basin in Houston. In order to get that into Europe, you need to freeze it. You need to ship it to a port. You need to have the port take a shipping vessel and sail it 4,000 miles across the Atlantic. You need to end up at a connective port in Portugal or Spain or Poland. Then you need to ship it to the destination. Then you need to unfreeze it, as opposed to a natural gas pipeline, which is an order of magnitude cheaper. So you have these high margin markets that were effectively created for Western companies by the sanctions roadshow. And it was done in the name of U.S. national security interests that we led this. We faked it. And we said, NATO, all your countries are under attack. Germany, Poland, Spain, it's going to get to you, Spain. If Crimea broke away now, Catalonia is going to break away with a Russian-backed, annexation effort. And the people didn't want this. And at the same time, you had this migration crisis. This is coming out of the 2013 to 2015. We had just assassinated Muammar Gaddafi. The floodgates were open into Europe. You had these NATO military programs effectively trying to get all these conflict zone families into Europe and giving them free housing, free health care, free food, free education, free cash debit cards, and sending back their spare cash and remittances to CIA and NATO-backed rebel armies in Africa and Pakistan and Syria. This is the middle of our, Operation Timber Sycamore CIA operation in Syria, and so you had these CIA refugee programs just flooding in. And the populist right-wing folks wanted cheap energy. They wanted to preserve their national heritage, their national identity, and they didn't want the refugees. They didn't want to help. They didn't want any of that, and so they were getting in the way of a large number of priority items for the U.S. national security state, the U.S. foreign policy establishment, the hedge funds that make billions of dollars off of investments in all these regions.
Orban is a good example, just in Washington, just continuously called an authoritarian. Yeah.
Perfect example, right. And so, but what you have here is the same problem that communist countries presented to the blob, the U.S. the foreign policy establishment and its international allies, are the same problems that were presented from the right-wing populist side in the post-2016 election climate. And so they simply use the same tools, the same tactics, the same legal predicates, the same networks, the same NGOs, the same government agencies, the same government programs within those government agencies, and called right-wing populism a threat to democracy the same way they called left-wing communism a threat to democracy. The difference is, I don't think the American people had any clue this was happening, unlike the Cold War, where it was very clear to those who were, in it and alive at the time that there was a great war with the Soviet Union. And, so this was all cloaked under secrecy. And thank God now much of this is breaking open, but there's much more to go.
Yeah, I was going to say how much of this, this is, the focus of your work, so it's not an easy or, quick answer, but how much of this is still happening? I saw you posting about Stanford recently, a source of so much of this nonprofit activity, nonprofit blob activity. It feels almost overwhelming.
This is the tip of my pinky finger. This is where we are right now. We are at, if you could zoom in with a microscope, to the subatomic level, that is how tiny a fraction of what has been published of versus what has been done. People don't understand the every structure of American society, of American commerce, of American governance, of American civil society is wrapped up in this apparatus. And in order to understand why those institutional players made the moves they did, we need transparency at every level. And I can go through a million examples of this, but something as simple as the teachers' unions. When you see Randy Weingarten out there, the head of the American Federation of Teachers, 1.7 million teachers, one of the most influential nodes. They're a part of the National Education Association, the main super umbrella for every U.S. public school teachers union. Randy Weingarten comes out of this apparatus. She was on the board of the National Endowment for Democracy, the CIA cutout that we were talking about earlier. The teachers unions were given millions of dollars by the Central Intelligence Agency during the Cold War. Just straight cash. $1 million given to the National Education Association, which is not only still around, it's the biggest teachers union in the country. The CIA was giving them millions of dollars in the 1960s and 70s. What today is called Education International, at the time it was called the World Confederation of Organizations of the Teaching Profession, was given millions of dollars by the CIA. Everyone listening to me right now, you can go to Google, just google.com, type in NEA, CIA, $1 million cash payments, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about here. Education International is still around today, and it is campaigning in every country on planet Earth to eradicate and politically mobilize to stop whatever right-wing populist party is in power there. And some of these are left-wing populist governments, as I mentioned, in Venezuela. They'll campaign against Maduro. If Jeremy Corbyn had won the election in the UK for the prime ministership, if he wasn't ousted by Keir Starmer, they would have run this against the left-wing populist Jeremy Corbyn in the UK. And I know this because I've seen all of these talks by all these NATO four-star general types and their State Department compatriots about what they were lining up against Corbyn. But the fact is any populist movement, the teachers' unions that's not just an international thing.
You can see this on your screen, by the way, right now.
Yeah,
if you're watching this is an article from the Akron Beacon, 1967. CIA piped $1 million to two teachers' groups.
So when you see the teachers' unions, they were going, now the purpose of that money, and that was just a little bit of it, the purpose of that money was to help the capacity build the teachers' unions, to make them stronger and more powerful and could hire more people and could have a bigger propaganda engine in order to influence curricula, in order to influence the ministries of education in foreign countries and influence the mythology to rid the culture, the culture understood by the kids from any Soviet Union affinity. It was done in the Cold War ostensibly to help win the Cold War. And today you see this same USAID State Department funding to these very groups. One of the groups mentioned there is today's Education International. I think we've given $1 billion to Education International over the past decade through the State Department and USAID. And Education International successfully campaigned to get the AFD. If you're a member of the AFD party in Germany, Education International mobilized to make sure that nobody affiliated with AFD can be a part of these teachers' unions in Germany, can have representation in the schools. They did the same thing to Bolsonaro in Brazil, the Education International. They're doing the same thing in Spain. They're doing the same thing in Italy. It's literally the same playbook, the same players for the same reason, except they didn't tell us this time. And part of the issue is nobody in the MAGA movement we did not inherit in a movement that had any real care at all about foreign policy in these international networks. The MAGA movement, in terms of the voting base, came from people who were sick of high crime, were sick of failing public schools, who were sick of government corruption from what they saw, and had no professional expertise in the global view of the American empire. And so in Trump 1, there was no attention to this at all from the White House. There was no attention to this at all from the State Department. USAID was completely rogue under Trump 1. And what we need now is a full declassification of all of this. And that will send an incredibly powerful message to whoever inherits these agencies next that we see you. You try to do this again, you're going to be on a Times Square jumbotron with your emails, your communications, your internal analysis memos, your decision memos. And I believe you mentioned Hungary. Mm-hmm. Imagine if the USAID Hungary files get produced. Samantha Power went full regime change against Orban, funding Hungarian media, Hungarian political organizations, Hungarian rule of law programs to influence the courts. All the way Hungarian student groups and activist groups and university centers. I want every single file to be declassified to the extent it's classified, to be published to the extent it's SBU sensitive but unclassified, and because no one consented to that, no one voted for that, and if you're going to do something like that, overturn a democratically elected government in a foreign country, you need a damn good reason, not just because it helps a bunch of your political insider cronies make money off of markets in the region. And that's the way we've conducted statecraft with this, because these networks, they're an easy button. They're all preset, good to go. It's the same networks every time. You're going to have the National Endowment for Democracy. You're going to have the Ford Foundation. You're going to have the Carnegie Foundation. You're going to have the Wilson Center. It's the same thing in every country. You're going to have the open society groups. You're going to have their friends in the university centers. You're going to have the international branch of the AFL-CIO in that local country. It's so predictable every time. And a lot of this just relies on secrecy, because they say anything that has to do with foreign policy, it impacts America on the world stage, and so therefore it's classified. So therefore you can't FOIA it. Therefore you get no transparency about what we do in international relations. And then these networks come home. Every single one of these groups is active at home. The Ford Foundation is active at home. The Open Society Foundation is active at home. And so while they're getting hundreds of millions of dollars in government subsidies for international affairs work, they've now hired tens of thousands of people to be able to play around and engage in all sorts of domestic operations to destabilize this one, the same way they're paid to do by our government to do abroad.
Really fascinating how Bill Gates and George Soros have both. I mean, Soros passed the baton to his son. Bill Gates is now trying to be a little bit more persuasive to the Trump administration. I don't even know how to describe it, but it's quite interesting that they seem to be seeing the writing on the wall, Mike.
Well, I don't know about that. I know
they're trying to adapt, right? Like they're trying to survive. Tell me if I'm wrong. I'm very open to the idea that I'm wrong, as always.
No, I know it's. There should perhaps be a certain nod given to Bill Gates's statement that the climate change hysteria is not existential. It's still a really big problem, but it's not existential, and other problems like poverty and the like are. I mean, so we need a lot more than that from Bill Gates before we start moving him down the power rankings on this. Bill Gates pledged $200 billion to the Gates Foundation after the U.S. aid cuts were announced. Bill Gates basically stepped in and said, okay, over the next 20 years, I will be giving $200 billion to the Gates Foundation to help offset the what appears to be a potentially long-term downturn on U.S. International aid given out through U.S. aid and State Department grants and the like. So the Gates Foundation is stepping up to be the kind of Gates private empire version of U.S. aid. I mean, 200 billion divided by 20 years is 10 billion a year. U.S. aid's budget is 45 billion a year. So, that's 20% of U.S. aid almost right there. And it's important to understand that Gates is Microsoft. Microsoft is rotates between the number one and number two biggest company on planet Earth. It recently lost its top seat to NVIDIA, which, NVIDIA, because they're just kind of a chip company, they don't have the kind of far-fangled operation that Microsoft has set up over decades. But Microsoft is a huge player in this entire field of CIA, State Department, U.S. aid work. I mean, I'll give you an example. I mean, Microsoft is co-partnered with USAID and the State Department and the National Endowment for Democracy in almost all of these initiatives to stamp out right-wing populism. And a big part of this is because they get fat government contracts from these countries or from these EU resilience funds. This is playing out in Poland right now. The EU withheld funds to Poland when the PIS party was in power. The right-wing populist party that was giving NATO a bit of a headache. And they said, until they make these civil society and governance reforms, we are going to withhold, I think it was like $143 billion in EU disbursement funds to Poland. And a huge chunk of that $143 billion was earmarked for Microsoft contracts basically, if those funds could be unlocked, Microsoft makes billions of dollars. And those funds are still making its way through the disbursement funnel. And they're trying to, because part of this is Poland just elected this right-wing populist president, Karol Nawrocki. And lo and behold, the Obama Foundation has just leapt into action to work with Polish civil society institutions to stamp out threats to democracy in Poland. Well, who are the biggest sponsors of the Obama Foundation? The Gates Foundation, $100 million. The Ballmer Foundation, I think another $100 million or $50 million. Steve Ballmer, also Microsoft. Microsoft makes another, I think, $25 million foundation. This is just an ROI. They're basically spending hundreds of millions of dollars on a play that could net them billions of dollars. And you see this same phenomenon play out everywhere, where you have corporate sponsorship of regime change. And this has basically balkanized U.S. politics along which corporations support which president. That president then goes out and uses taxpayer money to do regime change to pay off their donor class buddies who then draft off of the policies that the president implements. And so this is the George Soros playbook. This is how he became a billionaire in the first place, was this donor drafter class type operation where he will fund a U.S. political movement or party, and then they will institute various initiatives. And this happened in Mongolia in the early 2000s when George Soros was sponsoring all these State Department activities, and the State Department helps one of his portfolio companies, Rio Tinto, gets the rights to the world's largest copper mine in Mongolia. So meanwhile, the Soros hedge fund is betting on the stock of Rio Tinto, while the U.S. State, a British mining firm, while the U.S. State Department is bending over ass backwards into a sort of Gumby-like, twister game in order to make sure a foreign country's mining firm gets the rights to a Mongolian copper mine, so that the hedge fund magnate who sponsored the U.S. politicians is happy with them and will support them in the next election cycle. But you see this everywhere. This is what's happening in Ukraine with the Ukraine reconstruction. This is what's happening with all the creditors to the World Bank whenever these countries get in trouble with the World Bank. And so you see this international creditor class as well as the equity class in on this. But this is what we're up against, but it's contorted every institution in American society. Harvard is the same. The university system is exactly as tainted as the union system, as I mentioned. With the teachers' unions and AFL-CIO, the universities are the major hub of this. Where do all of these blob creatures go when they're put on ice, when their party loses? What is Jake Sullivan doing now? He's now a professor of statecraft at Harvard University, and he'll rotate right back into the next administration. Harvard University, the head of the Harvard Endowment, the $56 billion hedge fund that has a small university called Harvard College attached to it, right. Is Penny Pritzker. Penny Pritzker is who sponsored Barack Obama's Senate rise. His whole political career comes from Penny Pritzker. Penny Pritzker, who was then the Secretary of Commerce under Obama and was made special envoy for Ukraine reconstruction, herding all the cats to invest in Ukraine. Do you think the Harvard Endowment is a part of that investment flood in Ukraine, given that they sit on $56 billion of hedge fund assets, and that the head of the Harvard Endowment is spearheading all the other co-investors into Ukrainian gas, Ukrainian agriculture, Ukrainian rare earth minerals? So what do you think Harvard University is teaching its kids in its poli-sci department? What do you think it's teaching kids in its history department about Orange Man Bad? What do you think it's teaching its kids in its intelligence studies about what happened during Russiagate? What do you think it's teaching kids in its international affairs? Do you think they're going to mention that USAID spent $5 billion funding the Maidan Square revolution? Or do you think they're going to say, oh, that was a mostly peaceful arson protest? What I'm saying is, every aspect of our domestic civil societies grew to the scale they did and are what they are because they had a competitive advantage over other domestic institutions in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s who did not have the backing of Cold War Uncle Sam to outcompete those other institutions. So now Harvard is what it is. So now the AFL-CIO is what it is. So now the American Federation of Teachers is what it is because it had help from the U.S. government in these soft power relationships, in these funding relationships built up over decades. And so they are now the reigning number one domestic institutions. And there's no space for these alternate institutions because if I want to compete with Harvard University, I need to compete with the fact they get $9 billion a year in free money from the federal government. $9 billion right. in government grants Harvard University gets.
Amazing.
That's not a free market in education. If I want to start a competing union, I need to contend with the fact that the AFL-CIO gets more in government grants than they do in dues fees from unions. They get $72 million in government grants and about $68 million in union fees. If I want to start a union, can I get $72 million a year from the government to help me hire people, do propaganda for me, to build capacity? So, and it's the same way all the way down. If I want to start some sort of alternate, legal trade association, self-regulatory organization to police the legal profession. If I want to start an alternate American Bar Association, I need to contend with the fact that the American Bar Association gets tens of millions of dollars a year from USAID and the U.S. State Department, and as well as indirect ones through subgrants from USAID contractors. What I'm saying is this whole relationship has to be renegotiated, or you're going to run into the same problem every time.
Incredible. Well, we have more just after this quick break.